how did bulimia manifest for you, and what can people listening take away to spot the warning signs? If they're a man, talk more about it than they might be led to believe that they can, because it is more common it's more common for women to talk about it. I actually don't know the statistics, but it's more common for women to talk about it and for that to be a thing that we consider than it is in men, I believe. So do you want to just run us through
Yeah,
that?
yeah, I'd love to. And it's important to have these chats because I definitely found it so hard to talk about. I was, suffering in silence for many years because of that shame. And because it's seen as a female issue, it just didn't feel, I didn't feel comfortable talking about it. There was always this kind of hesitation around people when I tried to talk about it, whereas depression and anxiety are much more understood, I think. And it is common. I think there is a lot more of it in sport than we're probably aware of, because sadly, there's probably a lot of people suffering in silence. How it manifested for me links back to when I was injured. So I mentioned when I was about 16, when the Everest goal kind of suddenly had kind of a time pressure. Um, and there's lots and lots of factors at play, but for me, it started because I couldn't run, and very much being a kind of a high achiever, a perfectionist kind of mindset, or at least a high striver. I wouldn't say I'm a high achiever, but definitely a high striver. Um, the standards have always been high, and whilst I couldn't run, I wanted to try and do everything I could to make me come back as a better runner. I wanted to be the best. I had really big goals and ambitions. Um, I've always been very health conscious as well because of the epilepsy and all the time in hospital as a kid, and I think that played a part in it. But essentially, I tried like cutting out all these bad foods. I researched things obsessively. I tried to copy all these like elite runners and their diets, and cutting out everything. And naturally, I wanted to change everything at once. And as we know, with any kind of diet or habit change, it's not sustainable. You change one thing at a time. But I cut out everything and tried to live like a monk for a while. Naturally, that wasn't going to be that that wasn't going to last. And then what happened was, as I was trying to essentially starve myself and cut down all these things, when I failed to do that, the frustration and the depression around that, and the failure to meet my standards, led then to these kind of frustrated binges. And when you deprive your body of something, it will do everything it can to get what it needs. And essentially, what started was from trying to restrict was these massive like binge episodes. And because I was injured at the time, I couldn't deal with the depression. I couldn't deal with the stress of it. So binging then became kind of a coping way of dealing with all this stress. But when it got to the point of binging that I was worried about weight gain and the health consequences, that was when, after about 6 months, when the purging started. And then this is like, wow, I've got a way to have my cake and eat it. But obviously, I soon realised that wasn't quite as easy as it seems, and actually to actually make yourself sick, is obviously quite an extreme thing to do. But what then happened is when you kind of have this way of coping and managing it and being able to have these binges and then kind of almost, undo the consequences, you then have this habit that's wired into you. And that's when actually that becomes your default, not just for, kind of body composition and weight gain and trying to stay slim. I wanted to stay as this, thin, really kind of, at the time I was a reasonable kind of 10K half marathon runner. Um, it then becomes your go-to for any kind of emotional stress. And even times when you're not actually that stressed, you just do it because maybe you're a bit bored. Um, and I don't quite know how it gets to that point. I'm not an expert by any means, but that then actually was there, that even when I got back to running, even when I was healthy, I was training, I was managing, I could eat a lot more because I was burning it off. I've always been really thin. Like I'm built to run. I couldn't do all the amazing stuff you do. Like, gyms are not for me, but I've always been really thin. And even when I could run, the bulimia was still there. And I thought that, okay, when I get back to running, it'll go away, but it didn't. Ever since then, it was just my default response, and the risks of it, the actual dangers of it in terms of what it does to your heart and your body and all sorts of things over time. That's what scared me, even considering I was training. But it was the one thing that I just couldn't seem to control. Like I'd managed depression and anxiety pretty well through exercise, through my own tools, but this was something else. It really was, and nothing I did could control it. And I think that's why I I was afraid of asking for help, because I was ashamed of myself. I was frustrated with myself, but that frustration just makes you do it more and more and more. In terms of warning signs, the thing is, you get so good at hiding it. It's not like anorexia, and I've tipped to that side of things as well a few years ago, where people can see that you're losing weight and you don't see that at all. But with bulimia, you're normally a healthy weight. Um, it was my mum that finally noticed after about 4 or 5 years of this. But because I worked in a kitchen at the time, it was all very hidden. Um, so I mean, so much change, but basically, what got me out of it eventually was, I'm trying to think what. But that was literally when I finally realized that this is something I couldn't manage on my own. I mean, even on expeditions in Tibet, I was purging. Even when I'm in my happy place, because that was how wired into me it was, that I couldn't just break the cycle. So it's not like, oh, I just, I do it when I'm stressed. Um, but those warning signs are what kept it so hidden for so long. And when my mum finally kind of found out and kind of quietly asked me, I just broke down. But she was amazingly supportive, and my GP was amazing, and I only wish I'd been able to ask her sooner. These things aren't an overnight process. It was probably about 3 years later that I finally got the therapy that I really needed. And I consider myself now as recovered. I'm probably 2.5 years into that, and I still don't have a healthy relationship with food. I have to really monitor that carefully, but I don't have to kind of calorie count now. I'm a healthy weight. I trust my body knows kind of how to, it knows how to maintain itself. But one of the key factors in that journey was 2019. I moved to the lakes, so massive life change, lots of stress, lots of change. Being able to buy my own food, not having anybody around me to kind of watch me, and I was so underfueled. I was so underweight and running so many miles, and wondered why I was racing so badly. And because I was underfueled, And I remember one weekend I was in Bristol for a talk, and I remember just going on an all-out binge. I just ate everything I could because my body was just desperate for it. That's all I could think about was food. And yet I didn't purge. I realized that my body, that the world didn't end. Just because I ate too much. That weekend I won a 10K race. It was almost like, oh, this is what my body needs. And if you can't have both. You can't kind of underfuel and expect performance. And that was when the penny dropped. And since then I've been in a much better place. I've had dips, but I control it.